Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the first of two lectures that introduces you to vertebral anatomy. To start, we're going to look at how vertebrae are actually divided up along the vertebral column, along with some rules for distinguishing them. Then we'll take a look at an individual vertebra and define some of their features and purposes. And finally, we'll get started on looking at the individual divisions, starting with the cervical vertebrae today. In a previous lecture, we learned that the vertebral column is part of the axial skeleton, and adult humans have 26. They are divided into multiple regions. Going down from the skull, we have the cervical vertebrae, and we have 7 of those. And so on this image here, you can see these are the 7 cervical vertebrae. Moving down then, we have the thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 of those. So here are the thoracic vertebrae. And then we have the lumbar vertebrae, and there are 5 of those. And then finally, we have the sacral vertebrae. There are 5 to start with, but then when an individual matures, they fuse into one, and there's the sacral vertebrae right there. And finally, we have the coccygeal vertebrae, more commonly known as the tailbone. Once again, it starts out with several very small ones that eventually fuse. Now, a human anatomist or even an anatomy student in a human biology class usually learns to distinguish the vertebrae by the number. That is, they count the first 7 down and say, okay, those are the cervical vertebrae. Then they count the next 12 down and they say, okay, these are the thoracic vertebrae, and the next 5 are the lumbar vertebrae, etc. And that works okay for humans, but when we get into just the general world of mammals, that doesn't hold up so well, because you're making the assumption that the mammals have 26 vertebrae, and most do not. Many mammals have many, many more vertebrae than that. So we need a different set of rules to help us define where are the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal vertebrae in different mammals. So what we're going to do is we're going to formally actually define 2 of them. We will define the thoracic vertebrae as going to be vertebrae that actually articulate with the ribs. And in this image here, you can see I've circled them for you with the pointer. Any thoracic vertebrae will have a rib attached to it or articulated with it, and that's how you know it belongs to the thoracic vertebrae, because it forms part of the thoracic cage. And then down here we have the sacral vertebrae. In this case, we only have one that's fused. The sacral vertebrae are attached to the pelvic girdle or the hip bones to form the pelvis. And I'm actually going to show you a real picture. So I have a real sacral vertebrae right here, and you can see that to start, there were actually several vertebrae that eventually fused into one. So that's a feature that is somewhat unique to humans. And then let's actually define the rest of them. How do we define a cervical vertebrae? Well, the cervical vertebrae are going to be defined as the vertebrae between the skull and the thoracic vertebrae. Likewise, the lumbar vertebrae are going to be defined as any vertebra that's between thoracic and sacral, and the coccygeal vertebrae are going to be below the sacral vertebrae. So essentially, you define thoracic and sacral, and then cervical, lumbar, and coccygeal fit in between them. Now, interestingly, the word coccygeal usually gets replaced with caudal when you are looking at mammals with tails. So many, many mammals have tails, and their coccygeal vertebrae get another name or a new name. It's caudal vertebrae. So think of them as one and the same. Now that we've learned how to define them, let's go ahead and learn how to identify the various parts of a vertebra in any mammal. So I encourage you to get out a piece of paper and a pencil, possibly colored pencils, and try to sketch out this diagram here and label the parts as we go through them. This is a vertebra that's been basically a top-down view, and you can see several features have been color-coded for you. First and foremost, we have this region right here, and this region that's in purple is the vertebral body. This is going to provide the support for the vertebra and allow one vertebra to stack on top of another one. But then we have all of these pieces that seem to kind of come off that vertebral body, including the yellow area, which forms the vertebral arch. Now with that vertebral arch, we realize that we've created a nice hole here, And any hole in anatomy is called a foramen. So that hole is actually called the vertebral foramen, and the vertebral foramen holds the spinal cord. So this is where your spinal cord is protected. It's protected by this nice vertebral arch and the body. Additionally, we seem to have these projections. Any projection is called a process, and so we have a couple of them. We have two that basically go out or flare out, and both of those are called transverse processes, and I've got them marked here. There's one, and the other is on the other side. And then we have one that runs straight back, and that's called the spinous process. If you have a partner that's willing, you can basically run your finger along the spinal column of your partner, and what you are feeling, those ridges, are the spinous processes. So those represent the processes that are basically protruding out from the arch. Now we have some other ones that are shown here in pink, and those we're just going to call the articular processes because they help articulate with vertebra that are above or below that particular vertebra. So now that we've seen the anatomy of a vertebra, let's actually turn to a side view and see if we can identify some of the same parts, and then we'll move and take a look at some real vertebra and see how they stack together. So this right here is a side view of that same vertebra. This is the vertebral body. Right here is the spinous process. We have the transverse process here. That hole that you see with the arrow going through it, that's the vertebral foramen. And then the articular processes are going to be these areas that kind of end in a flattened disc, right here, and then up here and up here. And if you turn to the other picture, you can see that they stack together, one right on top of another. But enough with pictures, let's take a look at the real thing. So over here, I actually have a real thoracic vertebra, and you can take a look and see some of the features that we've already described. So if I put it down, you can see we have the vertebral body, we have the arch, we have the transverse foramen, the transverse processes, the spinous process, and then this hole, which you can fit something through, holds the spinal cord. And then if I flip it over on its side, you can see some of the same processes. This is the spinous process, this is the transverse process. Now, how do these guys fit together? And it turns out they fit together something kind of like this. So what I'm going to do is just take apart two of them and show you how the articular processes help them fit together. So right here I've got two thoracic vertebrae, and if I pull them apart, you can see that there's some flat discs there where the next one basically fits on top. And that helps stabilize the entire vertebral column and creates rather limited range of motion between individual vertebrae. All right, now that we've looked at that, let's go ahead and take a look at cervical vertebrae. Humans have 7 cervical vertebrae. They're going to be defined as the first 7 located between the skull and, of course, the thoracic vertebrae. Now this picture right here shows you a typical cervical vertebrae, and you might notice something a little bit unusual. It looks a little different, especially with these additional little holes here. And as it turns out, those holes are called transverse foramen, and they are unique to cervical vertebrae. Those transverse foramen are actually going to allow for additional arteries and veins, vertebral arteries and vertebral veins, to travel between the head and the body. And that's because, of course, the brain requires an absolute blood supply. You cannot lose your blood supply to the brain, and so the body is designed to protect those arteries with that additional foramen. So that's one of the ways that you can identify cervical vertebrae, is by looking for those additional holes, the transverse foramen. We're going to come back over here and take a look at some special cervical vertebrae and some of their features. This is one very similar to the picture that I just showed you, and once again, we still have the original vertebral foramen, but then we have the ones that are on the side, and these are the transverse foramen there. Now, most cervical vertebrae look like that, but the first 2 in humans are special, and they are called C1 and C2 respectively because they represent the first and the second. This right here is the first one. I'll just go ahead and rotate it around so you can kind of see it there. And this right here is the second one. And when you rotate it around, you might notice this additional projection here called a dens. like so. And the first two fit together very, very precisely like so. Now what's unusual about it is the way that the dens of C2, the second one, holds C1 in place. And what that does is allows this type of motion. So lots of range of motion of a specific point between C1 and C2. I'm going to put these down and I'm going to come back and actually demonstrate that for you. So if you take a look at my head, you can actually see this motion. The C1 and C2 allow you to shake your head or say no. So that's a unique feature of those vertebrae. Okay, now that we've learned about vertebrae in humans, let's turn to cervical vertebrae in marine mammals. Now, a very interesting feature about cervical vertebrae in mammals in general is that almost every mammal has 7. And it doesn't matter how long the neck is, because clearly the cervical vertebrae form the neck. Giraffes, which have the longest necks, still have 7 cervical vertebrae. They're just huge and elongated. Whereas mammals that have almost no neck, such as many whales and dolphins, still have 7 cervical vertebrae. So the number doesn't change, but the size and the function of them changes between different mammals. There is one exception to this within the marine mammal arena, and that is going to be certain sirenians actually have lost one of their cervical vertebrae and have 6 instead of 7, but this is a rarity within the mammal area. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the trends of the cervical vertebrae. If you have a permanently aquatic species, and this would include cetaceans, and remember cetaceans are going to be your whales and your dolphins, and your sirenians, which are like your manatees, they don't have a need for a neck as a rule, in part because they're constantly in the water. And if you're in the water and you have a really feeble neck, then as you're trying to plow through the water, your neck is actually going to be a disadvantage. Having a mobile neck will be a disadvantage. And that's because as the water hits your head, and if it pulls your head in one direction or another, you're going to start creating a lot of drag. It would be very similar to the idea if you were to swim with your hands down and your head forward, and someone were to just basically drag you through the water for 12 hours. Pretty soon your neck muscles would get very sore from trying to hold your head still and straight forward. So not having a neck is actually an advantage for these animals. As a result, their cervical vertebrae have become greatly reduced, and you can see this on this skeleton right here. Between the head and the thoracic vertebrae is the cervical vertebrae, and it's especially compressed. In fact, sometimes it's so compressed the bones are actually fused together to not only shorten the neck, but also prevent the range of motion. Now, within the cetaceans, there are 2 exceptions, and they are the belugas and the narwhals. And the belugas and the narwhals are special because they still actually have some range of motion within their cervical vertebrae. When you watch belugas swim, you can actually see this because they can turn their head side to side a little bit and up and down. And one possible reason why they have maintained this mobility within their cervical vertebrae may be because of their habitat. Both belugas and narwhals live in an ice-covered habitat, and sometimes in order to breathe, they have to break through that layer of ice. So you could see how it would be an advantage to actually be able to move your neck up and down and hit the ice with the top of your head to break it. So that's one possible reason why the belugas and the narwhals have actually maintained their cervical mobility when all the others have lost it. In contrast, the pinnipeds come out onto land, have to avoid predators, and so they still have elongated necks with lots of mobility. And we see that when we take a look at a pinniped skeleton, and you can see the vertebrae are much longer. So pinnipeds have mobility and elongated necks with longer cervical vertebrae. Permanently aquatic species have compressed, and this again is an idea of form matching function. With that, I'll see you for the second component of this lecture, Vertebral Anatomy Part 2.